The US President-elect on Monday unveiled his economic team comprising experienced policymakers in Washington. Janet Yellen, the former Fed chair, was nominated as Treasury Secretary, and Wally Adeyemo, president of the Obama Foundation and former international economic official, as Yellen's deputy. Neera Tanden, the former senior aide to Hillary Clinton and a president of the Center for American Progress think tank, was named budget director, and Brian Deese, a BlackRock executive, as director of the National Economic Council. Biden also selected 3 progressive economists to lead the White House's Council of Economic Advisers, which reports to and guides the president on economic affairs. Biden said his team will deliver immediate economic relief for the American people, especially those who have been hit the hardest by COVID-19, as well as address some of the country's structural inequities. So it looks like the team will have to hit the ground running to deal with the pandemic-hit American economy, and we discussed the challenges they face over the months to come. For this, I'm joined by Dr. Larry Samuelson, Professor of Economics at Yale University. It's wonderful to see you again.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We also have Heather Long, economics correspondent for the Washington Post. It's lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start with you, Dr. Larry. Now, we've had a lot of encouraging developments on vaccines over the last few days, over the past week. And while the spiraling COVID-19 infections, so they're continuing, and we're expecting things to get possibly worse as the cold season starts. And this has really led economists to sharply downgrade their GDP growth forecasts for the first quarter of 2021. But forecasts are looking more optimistic starting from the second quarter. I was wondering if you would agree with that view, and to what extent you think we'll see businesses recover once vaccines start being rolled out.
I do agree with that view. It's interesting that 2020 results are coming in more encouraging than first thought. China is slated to grow in 2020. Most other economies will contract, but not nearly as much as was once thought to be the case. For 2021, 3 key variables that are just very hard to predict. One is how well we handle the virus before a vaccine is on the scene. So far, the news is not too encouraging on that score. Second one is how soon a vaccine comes and is rolled out into widespread use. And the third one is the extent to which governments can provide additional stimulus to the economy. The handling of the virus, as I suggested and as you indicated, is not very encouraging, and this is what I believe has prompted the first quarter forecast to be downgraded. We have some encouraging news on the vaccine, but it's clear it won't be in widespread use until the second quarter or so, and so that leads us to be a little more optimistic about the second quarter. Possibility of government stimulus is very hard to predict. So putting these things together, I think we need to be very cautious going into the year, and we might hope for things to pick up as the year goes along. In terms of do we expect businesses to recover, we certainly expect improvement, but it's going to be very unevenly spread. Some sectors, especially those that depend heavily on personal contact, hospitality, entertainment, travel, tourism, are going to take much longer to recover. Others, we hope to see more quickly some gains from.
Right, so some businesses are going to bounce back very quickly, but as you said, it's going to be very uneven with some businesses, especially with high contact, that are going to be quite slow to make that recovery. And Dr. Larry, then what kind of long-term damage do you expect the pandemic to have on the American economy? And how do you think governments can then really prepare to make a strong recovery when time comes?
We knew even before the advent of the virus that inequality was becoming an increasingly serious problem in our economy. And this pandemic has exacerbated that. Many of the losses have been concentrated at the bottom end of the economic scale. And so dealing with inequality is going to be all the more challenging as we go forward. The new administration appears to be committed to addressing that problem. It's not going to be easy, especially if they do not have support from the Senate. And so I think that's going to be a difficulty that's going to be with us for some time. Biden's choices, especially at the Council of Economic Advisors and the Treasury, suggest that he has a real commitment to improving labor market conditions and improving conditions for workers. And so we hope that that turns into some progress on inequality. It will be interesting to see.
And Heather, I want to know your thoughts on this. How do you think the government can really prep for the recovery to be strong once things start looking up?
Well, we really need stimulus from Congress. That's people across the political aisle have been calling for that. We may have a chance here December 11th, so the end of next week. The Congress must refund the government, otherwise the government will shut down in the middle of a pandemic, which would be horrendous. So Congress is expected to come together to pass more funding to keep the government from shutting down. It's possible they could attach more money, particularly for those small businesses that Dr. Larry was just talking about, and also for the 20 million Americans who still remain on unemployment. So they don't have a job. They're currently getting checks for about $200 to $400 a week to try to tide them over. And as we head into the recovery in 2021, what really needs help from the government are those three areas. We don't want to be in a world where all these small businesses are wiped out and we only have big businesses left, so we need more support for small business. Unfortunately, even though those economic projections look pretty good for the summer that Dr. Larry was just talking about, it does not look so good for workers. Workers are not expected to be fully back to work, all those millions of people who are out of a job, until 2023 or 2024. So we've still got a long way to go to get people back to work. We're going to need to support people through that transition. And the last thing that doesn't get enough talked about is state and local governments in the United States do not have enough money. They are running out of cash, and they will end up cutting jobs next year if the federal government does not give them a little bit more aid.
Well, you've reported a lot about this. You've tweeted a lot about this. Just everyday life's been impacted so heavily by this pandemic, and there are more than 20 million Americans receiving unemployment benefits now, and the jobless rate is nearing 7%. How uneven will this recovery be, and will service workers then have to really wait for much longer until they can really stabilize their livelihoods?
We can already see it in the data. It's really scary. If you look at who's getting jobs back, and we have been able to get some people back to work, and that's great for those folks, but basically what we see, the people who are not getting back to work, it's mainly black workers and women. So what we're seeing is white workers have recovered about 60% of the jobs versus black workers in the United States have only recovered about 33%. Massive gap there. Similarly, for women, a lot of moms in the United States have had to quit their jobs. In September alone, close to 1 million women just dropped out of the labor force because in the United States, we haven't been able to reopen a lot of schools and daycares. We're still doing a lot of virtual classes, and that is forcing women to quit their jobs in order to basically homeschool their children or to monitor their virtual classes. So that's going to be a real challenge in 2021. How do we get more women back into the labor force, and how do we make sure that black workers particularly get back into work? It's a big open question, as you say. Are those restaurants just going to magically reopen in the spring and summer? We sure hope so, but nobody knows, are they going to reopen in the same place? Are we still going to need as many restaurants downtown Washington, D.C. or downtown L.A.? Are more people going to work from home, and we need more restaurants in the suburbs? That's what we still don't fully understand about what this recovery will look like.
Right, reopening is just so much easier said than done, it seems. And well, President-elect Joe Biden did pledge to address these kind of iniquities that you just mentioned as he appointed he nominated his economic officials today. And in that regard, Dr. Larry, now Janet Yellen was named Treasury Secretary, and of course, along with other key economic figures on Monday. How do you expect Biden's team to really handle this economic crisis going forward?
It's useful to remember that Janet Yellen was the head of the Fed from 2014 to 2018, when we had a reasonable recovery going in this country from the last economic crisis, but still a fragile recovery. And she handled that quite deftly. She has good relations with all of the people she needs to have to be effective going forward. Now, the Fed is out of weapons to deal with a pandemic. It has pushed interest rates as low as it can. It has given as much stimulus to the economy as the Fed can. There are just limits to monetary policy, and it's time for a robust fiscal policy to address this crisis. And that's just what she can do at Treasury. Her appointment, the appointment to the Council of Economic Advisors, the rest of the team suggests that Biden is going to be interested in infrastructure, is going to be interested in labor markets, and is going to be interested in inequality. These things combine nicely. An infrastructure project will be one of the ways of addressing employment and inequality issues. So I think there is every reason to believe that we're going to see some effective policy. Some of it will be stimulus in the short term. In the longer term, we can expect to see government spending programs and government policies designed to employ more people, especially on infrastructure projects, and to strengthen the role of workers, their bargaining, their working conditions in our economy.
So really her nomination there really puts, it really offers reassurance to both the progressives and the conservatives, I suppose. And well, Heather, I would like to know your thoughts on Monday's nominations as well. Of course, Janet Yellen, being a Labour economist, as Dr. Larry just mentioned, and a firm believer in Keynesian stimulus. How do you expect her to handle this pandemic recovery?
Well, the whole slate of economic advisors that were nominated today, most of them have been very outspoken proponents that we have too much inequality in the United States and we need to address this. And so that's why the Biden slogan was Build Back Better. We don't just need to recover from this COVID pandemic, we need to have a better economy, a more equal economy, particularly for women and minorities, but also a more environmentally friendly economy going forward. And so that's really going to be interlaced in everything that we do. Why did he choose Janet Yellen? Why are people so excited, from the progressives and the unions in the United States all the way to Wall Street? It's been a pretty big round of applause for her. She did a great job at the Federal Reserve. Unemployment fell the most while she was Fed chair of any Fed chair since World War II. That's a pretty good track record that we'd like to see happen again. She has respect from the Republican side. You saw the chair of the Senate Finance Committee actually telling reporters today, this is a Republican from Iowa named Chuck Grassley. He said, quote, that her nomination would be received favorably. That may not sound like huge praise, but coming from a very divided Republican-Democrat situation, that's practically a high five for Janet Yellen from the Republican side. And people are really looking to Yellen to play this role of trying to negotiate with Republicans and get them to release more stimulus money into the economy this winter. Longer term, I think she's really going to be, what she's best at is getting creative. At the Fed, she was involved in a lot of these. They're kind of technical, but she was able to put a lot of stimulus after that Great Recession with all these bond buying programs they did. At Treasury, I think she's going to get creative again. Treasury is sitting on a lot of different accounts and money. Can it be redeployed? These are questions that her lawyers are looking at right now, but I think we'll see a lot of her skill both in deal making with Congress and in getting creative with the limited resources she has.
Right, so we're expecting a lot of Keynesian creativity there coming from Janet Yellen, and obviously markets as well, they've reacted very favourably to her nomination as well. But then, of course, as you just mentioned, it's evidently very critical to pass the COVID stimulus plan before the end of the year. What support do Americans really need the most over the weeks and months to come? And Heather, if the stimulus plan fails to pass, then what impact is this going to have on the economic recovery?
Just before I came on this program, I was talking to a mom of 4 children in Nashville, Tennessee, one of our cities in the middle of the United States. And she's $3,000 behind on her rent. She lost her job in March. She's tried to get another job. She almost had one lined up this summer, and then she got COVID and couldn't take the job. And she's one of the millions of Americans who are still unemployed and still struggling. And she is slated to be evicted from her home in January in the middle of a pandemic. And I think that's what we're really talking about right now. Real people's lives on the line, that she and her children could be homeless in January in one of the richest countries in the world. And that's really what we're talking about. The Biden administration doesn't take office till January 20th. A lot of the protections that are currently in place to protect people from losing their home, being kicked out of their apartment, they expire on December 31st. What happens in those 20 days? And that's why people are really urging Congress to act. The other thing we're seeing is, unfortunately, a lot of the economic indicators are deteriorating in the last few weeks. So the reason that Dr. Larry and others have this negative outlook for the winter, we're starting to see unemployment claims, new unemployment claims have risen the last 2 weeks. We're starting to see spending go down. We're starting to see some small business data look like shops are having to pare back again as coronavirus cases rise. Basically, this is like the worst case scenario everybody feared.
Well, Dr. Larry, the pandemic has really just proven how heavily reliant the US is on mass consumption. Do you think going forward there need to be structural changes, and Joe Biden's plan on a green recovery from the pandemic involving huge infrastructure investment and hiking corporate tax? Are you optimistic about these plans?
I do think we need structural changes. I don't think the difficulty is so much our reliance on consumption, and I don't expect that to change very much. Infrastructure is a good place to start. We have neglected our infrastructure for far too long. We need to invest in that, physical infrastructure and also human infrastructure. Education on the one hand, physical things like roads, ports, water supplies, energy supplies on the other. This is something we need to catch up on. It does provide an opportunity. In particular, it provides an opportunity to push us in a greener direction in terms of our environment and our economy, and it allows us to provide some help in terms of unemployment and inequality if it's done in a reasonable way. Besides infrastructure, again, the sort of structural change we need is something to address the inequality that we see. As we've just heard, many people will get through this pandemic relatively unscathed. A few people will bear tremendous costs as a result of the pandemic, and they're often the people least able to bear such costs. And this is a structural problem with the economy that's been exposed by the pandemic, but has been there and will be there going forward. And so that is something we need some imaginative, creative policies to deal with. As for taxes, very much depends there on what happens in the 2 Senate races we have coming up in Georgia. Depending on which way those go, I think we are unlikely to see very many changes in the tax code, or we might have more hope for some tax reform.
So Biden has really shown his commitment to resolving these terrible immediate challenges that Americans face: joblessness, homelessness, all these things that the pandemic has really worsened over the months. And while he still has yet to fill other economic positions like the US Trade Representative, Commerce Secretary and Labor Secretary positions, so we'll have to wait to see his full lineup of officials there. But this is where we'll have to wrap up the discussion for today. That was Dr. Larry Samuelson, Professor of Economics at Yale University and Head Long Economics Correspondent for The Washington Post. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
And to our viewers, thank you as always for watching.